I never talked about this, not to my wife, not to my children, not even to myself, really. For decades, I hid my words behind polite silence and easy smiles. But they've always been there, tucked inside a wooden box at the back of my closet. 38 letters in total, all written to Claire between 1966 and 1973. While I was deployed in Vietnam, not a single one was sent. Writing them kept me alive. They were raw, honest, sometimes desperate, but always full of love. I promised I'd write to her, and I did, just never with the courage to mail them. The fear always won. I was afraid she'd see the man I had become, afraid my words would smell like smoke and gunpowder, like guilt and loss. So I held onto them, thinking maybe one day, when I returned home whole, I'd deliver them all at once. But I never came back whole. Today, I'm 80, and something shifted. Maybe it's the silence of the house. Maybe it's the ache in my bones that reminds me time isn't patient. Or maybe it's the simple truth that I don't want to leave this world with those words still sealed in paper and fear. So I opened the box, read every single letter, and cried, not because of what I wrote, but because of everything I never had the courage to say aloud. Claire was everything. My compass, my reason, my promise to the future. I left South Carolina with her picture in my wallet and the smell of her shampoo still lingering on the collar of my shirt. She waited for a while. But I didn't make it back in time, and I didn't write. The letters kept me going when nothing else did, when friends died, when I stopped recognizing myself, when the jungle turned louder than memory. Those pages were the only place I still felt human. And now I've decided it's time she hears the truth, or at least that the truth is finally spoken, even if it's to the wind. If this story touches you the way it touched me to write it, like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next changes everything. Claire was my anchor. Not just the girl I kissed behind the church after Sunday service, or the one who knew my favorite Johnny Cash record by heart. She was the voice in my head when the world got too loud, the smell of spring magnolias back home in Charleston, South Carolina, where everything felt slower, gentler, safer. I left in the fall of 1966 with her high school portrait folded in my wallet, and her lipstick still faint on the collar of my fatigues. We stood on the porch of her parents' house the night before I shipped out, and I swore, hand on my duffel bag, eyes locked with hers, that I'd write. I promised her letters, I promised her honesty, I promised her everything, and I did write. God, did I write? Not a day went by without me scribbling something. Scraps of memory, pages torn from field journals, even the backs of ration boxes when paper ran out. I wrote her about the things that didn't hurt. The color of the sky before a monsoon, the way the boys teased each other around the fire, the time I found a dog that reminded me of her old mutt, Sam. I wrote her about home, about my sister's wedding, about Mama's banana bread. But I never wrote about the body bags, about the smell of burnt skin, about waking up in a cold sweat because I thought the wind was whispering in Vietnamese. The truth is, I was scared. Not of dying, not really. What terrified me was the idea that she'd read one of my letters and see what the war had turned me into. That she'd hear the tremble in my words, smell the fear soaked into the ink, that she'd stop recognizing the man she waited for. And so I kept writing, but never sent a single one. At first, I told myself I'd send them all at once, a grand gesture when I came back, a box of love and longing that would explain everything. But the months kept passing, I kept changing. The boy who left Charleston was getting harder to find in the mirror each morning, and the letters, they weren't love letters anymore. They were confessions, apologies, silent screams wrapped in folded paper. I started hiding them, wrapped in a scarf Claire gave me once, tucked deep into my footlocker under medals I never cared to polish. They became sacred, a record of the man I couldn't be, and the woman I was terrified of disappointing. I reread them sometimes under my poncho when the rain wouldn't stop. I'd trace her name with my finger and whisper it like a prayer. But I never reached for a stamp. As weeks became years, my silence grew heavier. I could picture her walking to the mailbox day after day and finding it empty. I imagined the hope draining from her eyes, her smile fading just a bit more each week, and yet I still didn't write. I told myself I was protecting her, sparing her the ugly truth, but maybe I was just protecting myself from rejection, from shame, from the realization that maybe I wasn't worthy of her love anymore. By the time I realized what I had done, it was too late. Not just too late to send the letters, but too late to be the man she deserved. My fear had stolen years from both of us, and my silence, though wrapped in love, was still silence, still absence, still abandonment. That's the part that hurts the most. Not the wounds, not the nightmares, but knowing that I had something beautiful and I let it slip through my fingers because I couldn't bear to admit I was broken. I kept the letters anyway, carried them home in '74 like contraband. I couldn't leave them behind, just like I couldn't leave behind the guilt. They moved with me, apartment to apartment, state to state, always in the same box, wrapped in the same scarf, sealed with the same cowardice. They weren't just letters. They were the last pieces of the man I used to be. There's a certain kind of silence in the jungle that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not peace, it's pressure. It presses in from all sides, like the vines that grow so thick you can't see the sun. The air in Quang Tree clung to your skin, wet, heavy, alive. Every leaf looked like it could hide a sniper. Every breeze felt like it carried warning. And yet, in that hell of green and mud, every night when I could, I wrote. I'd flip my helmet upside down, rest it on my knees, and use it as a desk. Sometimes I had a flashlight wrapped in red cloth to keep the light low. Sometimes I wrote in pitch dark, letting my fingers guess the words. The paper would wrinkle from humidity, my pen would bleed or skip, but I didn't stop. Because in those moments I was somewhere else. Back on Claire's front porch, watching fireflies blink under the Carolina stars, sipping sweet tea she always said was too strong. I wrote about memories, not about war, about Sunday breakfasts with my brothers, about the way her voice cracked when she laughed too hard, about the time we got caught dancing barefoot in the rain outside the gas station. I never told her about the blood, about how bodies don't fall like in movies. They slump, slowly, with eyes still open. I didn't mention how long it took the smell of burning to leave your clothes. Or how sometimes, in the dead quiet, I heard my own name whispered from the trees, though I knew it was just my nerves unraveling. There was one night I'll never forget. Jackson, my best friend in the unit, had just died in my arms. We were on patrol, moving through a patch of bamboo, when a landmine caught him clean in the chest. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but only blood came. I held his head until it stilled. Didn't even notice I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. That night, I wrote for 3 hours straight. I couldn't stop. I poured everything into that letter. Grief, rage, loneliness, fear. But I never mailed it. I was afraid Claire would smell the jungle on the page, smell the rot, the cordite, the sweat of a man who hadn't been clean in weeks, who hadn't felt clean in years. I was afraid she'd read my pain and feel it too, and I didn't want to poison her with this war. That's the truth. I wrote to protect myself, but I didn't send the letters to protect her. They say war hardens you, but writing kept me soft, kept a piece of me human. Those pages were my only therapy. We didn't talk about trauma back then. We didn't use words like PTSD. We just drank, stayed quiet, or wrote things we never planned to send. I chose the third. Writing let me remember who I was, who I loved, who I wanted to be again if I ever made it home. I'd fold the letters carefully, wrap them in wax paper, or tuck them in zippered pouches so the damp wouldn't ruin them. Some were written on army forms, others on napkins, even toilet paper once. It didn't matter. The act of writing was what saved me, not the paper. Sometimes the younger guys in the unit would tease me. "What, you got a novel going back home?" They'd laugh. I'd grin, play along, but inside I knew they didn't understand. Those letters weren't for her, not anymore. They were for me, to remind me I was more than a uniform and a weapon, that I once held someone's hand, not just a rifle. I wrote about the past because the present was too much. I wrote about the way her perfume lingered on my pillow, about the scar on her wrist from that time she broke a glass, about the first time she said my name in a whisper. I never wrote about screaming, about fire, about the friend whose face I couldn't look at because it no longer resembled a face. That truth stayed locked inside me, but every letter still ended the same way. "I love you, and I still dream about your smile." Even when my hands trembled, even when my faith broke, even when I started forgetting what day it was, that line stayed, like a lighthouse in a sea I couldn't navigate anymore. I came back in the fall of 1974. The air smelled like damp earth and gasoline. Charleston looked smaller, quieter, like it had been holding its breath since I left. The harbor was the same, and yet nothing felt familiar. The house I grew up in had peeling paint and a new mailbox. The corner store was gone, and the people. They all looked at me like they wanted to say something but didn't know how. Or maybe I imagined that. Maybe I was the one who didn't know how to be seen anymore. I didn't go straight to see her. Part of me wanted to. Part of me needed to. But I circled the neighborhood 3 times before I finally parked 2 blocks away and walked. I still remember the sound of leaves crunching under my boots. The porch light was on. There were kids' toys on the steps, a tricycle, a plastic wagon. That's when I knew. A neighbor, old woman, kind eyes, sweeping the sidewalk, noticed me standing there. I asked about Claire. My voice cracked when I said her name. She looked at me for a long time, as if trying to place me in a photo album from the past, then said gently, "Oh, honey, Claire got married back in '70. She's out in Mount Pleasant now. 2 kids. Good husband. She cried at the altar, they say. I didn't ask anything else." I just nodded like it didn't break me, like the years hadn't unraveled behind my eyes in a single breath. Then I turned and walked. I passed that street many times afterward, but I never knocked on her door. What would I have said? "I'm sorry for the silence. I loved you, but not enough to be brave." I couldn't face her with war still clinging to my skin. I wasn't the man she remembered. I wasn't sure I ever had been. I took a job as a night guard at a shipping yard. Later, I worked the front desk at a local high school. Quiet jobs. Jobs that didn't require much talking. Jobs that gave me space to breathe, to disappear. I moved around a few times, from a rented apartment near the docks to a tiny place on James Island, and finally a small house surrounded by pine trees, where no one asked questions and I never had to explain the box I kept under my bed. The box came with me everywhere, always packed last, always unpacked first. 38 letters, wrapped in an old scarf that still faintly smelled like her perfume. I couldn't burn them. I thought about it 100 times, sat by the stove with a match in my hand, but never lit it, because those letters, unsent, unread, were the only proof that I had once believed in something, that I had once loved someone so deeply I couldn't bear to ruin it with the truth. Some nights I'd pull one out and read it, slowly, as if it were someone else's story. The handwriting got shakier as the years went on. Some words smudged by rain, others by tears I never admitted to, and always that final line, "I love you, and I still dream about your smile." I never married. I had companions, women I spent time with, but I never gave them my full self. Because part of me had stayed in a jungle halfway across the world, and the rest had stayed in those letters. I didn't go looking for Claire. I didn't call. I didn't write. Not because I stopped loving her, but because I was afraid to find out that she'd forgotten me, or worse, that she hadn't, and I'd have to face everything I'd destroyed. I lived like a ghost in my own life. Present, polite, functional. I paid bills, mowed the lawn, went to work, but I left parts of me buried in the jungle, in the letters, in the silence. People think the war ends when you come home. They don't understand that for some of us, it never does. That the hardest part isn't what happened over there. It's waking up every day knowing you were given the chance to return, and yet something inside you stayed behind. The box aged with me, the corners wore down, the paper yellowed, but I never added to it, never removed a thing. It sat at the bottom of my closet like a gravestone for a man I once was. And every time I moved, I carried it myself, wouldn't let anyone else touch it, like it was sacred, like if I lost it, I'd lose the last thread connecting me to who I might have been. It started with a phone call. A Tuesday morning like any other. Sunlight bleeding through the blinds, coffee gone cold beside a plate of untouched toast. I wasn't expecting anything. But when the nurse said, "The doctor would like to go over your results in person," my stomach dropped. It wasn't panic, it was clarity. Like something inside me straightened up and said, "Well, it's time." The diagnosis wasn't terminal. Not exactly. But it came with a look in the doctor's eyes that said, "You should start thinking in seasons, not years." I walked home slower than usual. The magnolias were in bloom. The world hadn't changed, but I had. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, the same one I'd had since '75, and pulled the box out from the closet for the 100th time. I laid the letters out in rows on the table like relics from another life, 38 in total, some on army stationery, some on napkins, one scrawled across the inside of a book cover. They smelled like paper and regret. I read through them all, front to back. My hands shook, my chest ached, not from illness but from memory. Then I reached for a clean sheet. This one felt different. There was no pretending, no shielding her from the pain, no romantic turns of phrase. Just truth, raw and plain. I wrote, "Claire, if these words ever find you, know that my silence was never the absence of love. It was fear. Fear that the man you once kissed on your parents' porch had turned into someone you wouldn't recognize. I didn't write because I didn't want to stain your memory of me with war. I held on to you like a lifeline, through blood, through death, through every night I wished I'd never woken up. But I was a coward. I chose silence, and for that I'm sorry." I sealed it, number 39. But I still didn't know what to do with them. Claire could be anywhere, or nowhere. She might not even remember me, or worse, she might remember everything. And I had no right to insert myself into her life again. But then life, strange, ironic life, handed me something I never expected. 6 months earlier, I'd started giving talks at a local high school. They called me Mr. Tom, the old Vietnam vet with the quiet voice and the eyes that didn't blink much. I never shared the full truth, but I tried to make the war human for them. The confusion, the fear, the bonds. One day after class, a girl stayed behind. Her name was Ellie, brown hair, freckles, sharp mind. We got to talking. She mentioned her grandmother, a woman named Claire, who used to live in Charleston, who once waited for a boy who went to war and never wrote. I don't know what tipped me off. Maybe it was the way she said her grandmother still looked at old photographs like they held breath. Or maybe it was the name, Claire, still echoing through my chest after all these years. I asked her quietly if she could meet me after school, just a short chat. She said yes. We sat in the library, in the back corner where the dust and silence meet. I handed her the box. She looked confused at first, then curious, then deeply still. I didn't say much, just, "If you think your grandmother would want these, give them to her. If not, destroy them. That choice is yours." She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She nodded, tucked the box under her arm, and left. And I sat there, in the echo of that moment, feeling something I hadn't felt in decades: release. I don't know if Claire ever read those letters. I don't know if she cried or smiled or tore them up. But I do know this: the words are no longer locked inside me. The truth, however late, is finally out in the open. I didn't need a reply. I didn't expect forgiveness. What I needed was to finally be honest. With her, with myself, with the boy I used to be before everything went dark. Some nights I still hear the jungle, I still smell the smoke, but now when I wake up I feel lighter, like maybe, just maybe, I've laid something to rest. I don't know if she ever opened that box. I don't know if her hands trembled like mine did when I sealed the last letter. Maybe she read them in one sitting, maybe she burned them without a word, maybe she never even saw them, and I'll never ask, because this isn't about whether she forgives me, or remembers me, or still wonders what happened to the boy who never came home. It's about knowing that after all these years, I finally told the truth, and that truth, however late, is its own kind of mercy. People talk about closure like it's a door you get to close neatly behind you, but for me, it's more like a window cracked open on a quiet night, letting something out that's been trapped too long, and for the first time in decades, I can breathe. All those years, I carried the weight of my silence like a second pack, heavier than any gear I wore in country, heavier than guilt, heavier than grief. Because silence, when it's soaked in love and fear, becomes its own kind of prison. And I lived in that cell for over 50 years. Now it's different. Now when I walk through my house, I don't glance at the closet with dread. I don't feel that itch behind my ribs every time I think of Claire's name. The box is gone. The letters are no longer mine. And with them went the part of me that never knew how to say goodbye. I sit on the porch some evenings, just like we used to. I sip my coffee, still black, still too strong, and I close my eyes. I don't imagine her face anymore. I don't need to. I remember the feeling. The warmth, the laughter, the promise, and the ache that used to follow, it softened, not gone, never gone, but quieter. Love doesn't always survive the battlefield. Sometimes it hides in the trenches of memory. Sometimes it retreats. Sometimes it waits. But even love left unspoken can shape a life. Mine was shaped by 38 unsent letters and one final truth. That truth was this. I loved her. I never stopped, but I let fear steal my voice, and I paid for it in silence. Still, I believe in grace. Maybe not the loud, cinematic kind, but the kind that comes quietly, in a young woman's nod, in the weight of a wooden box leaving my hands, in the air that suddenly feels lighter after a storm. I don't need a reply. I don't need a reunion. What I needed was to stop hiding. And I did. We all carry wars inside us, some with bullets, some with words left unsaid, but we don't have to carry them forever. Sometimes writing them down is enough. Sometimes speaking them, even if no one's there to hear, is the beginning of peace. So if you've been holding something in, don't wait as long as I did. Say it, write it, let it out. Because the truth, even when whispered decades too late, is still the most powerful thing we have. And now I can finally rest. We share new stories every day, real voices that move and inspire. If this story spoke to you, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.